Awesome. Thank you so much, everyone, for showing up today. I'm Sydney Bell, and I work in the Coral Health and Ecology Lab at Florida Atlantic University Harbor Branch. So before I get started, I wanted to share a little bit about who I am. So as I mentioned, I'm a graduate student. I'm currently working on getting my master's degree, and this involves doing a research project, which I just defended last week. So now I'm just finishing up my degree, and I'll be done next month. Along with being a student, I also get paid as a researcher here. So within my Coral Lab, I also work on a bunch of different other projects, and I get paid to be a research assistant along with being a student. I'm also a scuba diver, as you can see from these photos that I have popped up here. This is one of my main passions, and I'm lucky enough to get to do it every day for work. So all of these combined, you can call me a marine biologist, or more specifically, a coral biologist. And then alongside with doing science, I also like to work the other side of my brain. So I like to do art and use that as a way to promote ocean conservation. And then lastly, I just love to spend time outdoors. And you can see that from the many photos of me diving and just interacting with different organisms in the ocean. So to get started, I just wanted to give you a brief look at what a coral biologist does. So as I mentioned before, I do a lot of scuba diving. And this isn't, you don't have to be scuba certified to be a coral biologist or marine biologist, but in our specific lab, a lot of our work involves diving. And that's a big reason why I chose to get into this line of work. So while we're scuba diving or while we're in the field, we do a lot of sample collection. And I'll talk a little bit about this later on, but collecting samples helps us look at species diversity on our reefs and also genetic diversity. And an example of that is that little coral punch on the right-hand picture, and that's just a little sample from one of our corals. We also take a lot of measurements underwater. We go down bringing rulers, different measuring tapes, and we look at the size of our corals, and we can monitor them over time to see how fast they're growing. We can also do surveys underwater on underwater paper, and we can count and identify what is on our reefs. So we get a better idea of what the diversity is looking like and also the health of our corals. And along with health, we can also treat corals for disease if we notice that they appear sick. So that's something we can do underwater. We can basically administer medicine to corals, which is super neat. But aside from field work, a lot of being a coral biologist also involves working in a lab. So I'm sitting in my lab right now, so you can see it in the background, but this lab work involves doing molecular work. So we can do things like DNA extractions, and that's a major component of what my research project was. We can also use different equipment like microscopes. We can do this to look at individual polyps on a coral or look at things like coral eggs under a microscope. Being a coral biologist also involves a lot of computer coding, which isn't something you would expect, but this is done to aid in organizing our data and making nice figures that we can present to the public. This also involves a lot of writing, so we end up writing up all of our results in a way that we can convey our findings to other scientists and also the public. And then we also present our research. So that picture on the right is me presenting my research at a conference last summer in Germany to share our research with other scientists. So before I get too deep into my presentation, I wanted to play a little game. Scientists are basically like detectives, and we use things that we know and things we can observe from the environment to ask and then answer questions. So now I want to make you guys the scientists. So I'm going to give you 30 seconds. Can you either think in your brain or write down the numbers of these pictures? Write write down the numbers of the pictures that you think are corals. So not all of these are corals. So try and figure out which ones pictured up here are our corals. Okay. So I told you not all of these are corals. Let's see which ones are not corals. So we have a bunch of these, 7 of them, that are actually not corals at all. They are actually sponges and gorgonians. And these are our 5 coral species. So as you can see, it's really confusing and actually pretty difficult to distinguish what on the reef is a coral. So I wanted to pop this up so that when we get into later parts of my presentation, I can explain what is a coral, and then hopefully when you guys go out snorkeling, swimming, diving, you'll have a better understanding of what these species are that we're trying to protect in the ocean. So as we know from that game, corals are really complex and are made up of a bunch of components. So let's try and break down what a coral actually is. Because of their skeleton, which is made out of calcium carbonate, and this has a big 3D structure, corals can easily be mistaken for things like rocks. They could also be mistaken for a plant. They utilize sunlight to make sugars, which provide energy for all of the functions they perform. Adding on to that, you could also mistake a coral for an animal. They are cnidarian, so they're related to jellyfish and the Portuguese man-o-war. And they also have a microbiome, so they're made up of fungi, bacteria, and viruses. So many components. What is a coral? So a coral is actually a holobiont made up of all of these parts. So it has a skeleton, it has algae, so it does photosynthesis, but it is an animal, and it also has a microbiome of bacteria and viruses. So all of these parts are really important, and without any one of them, our corals can show decreased health, sickness, and eventually die. So breaking it down even more, corals are made up of hundreds of individual tiny polyps. And here's a picture of a polyp on your screen to the right. And polyps only have one opening, which is their mouth, and they rely on their tentacles that have stinging cells for things like defense and also to capture food. Some of the foods that our polyps consume are algae, plankton, small fish, and everything in between that's floating in the water column. And then these coral polyps use that food that they ingested to help them secrete a calcium carbonate skeleton. So they basically build themselves up in a cup-like limestone skeleton where they will root and they'll rest in this skeleton for the rest of their lives. But how do corals get enough food to secrete skeleton, reproduce, and build the reefs that we see today? It's not just from those tiny pieces of plankton and those small fish that they're able to pull into their mouths. It's actually from their algae. So the special algae that makes all the magic happen in corals is called Symbiodiniaceae, or symbiotic algae. And the symbiotic algae and the coral polyps have a mutualistic relationship. So this is a type of symbiotic relationship in which both parties benefit, and they rely on each other for survival. So the algal symbionts provide the coral with energy through photosynthesis, and this energy is 90% of the coral's food source. So these symbiotic algae are super important to our corals. And coral polyps can't live or survive on their own. Instead, they share. They're givers, they're connected, and they work in these large coral colonies. Connective tissue allows them to share nutrients and energy with the other polyps in their colony. And when these tiny polyps work together, slowly secreting their calcium carbonate skeletons, they build the coral reefs that we see today. And some of the reefs on our planet today started growing over 50 million years ago, which is crazy to think about. So I just wanted to show you a clip of this little video showing how these polyps, using their connective tissue, can grow huge corals over time. So we may not realize it, but these corals power our entire world. Millions of ocean creatures live in our coral reefs, and 1 in every 4 ocean animals at one point has inhabited a coral reef. Coral reefs also support billions of jobs and entire industries, and they can also help cure many diseases. So they help support our fisheries, ecotourism, the restaurant industry, and they can also help produce medical products such as products used to treat cancer and other viruses. And here in Florida, a major benefit of our coral reefs is shoreline protection. So our coral reefs absorb up to 90% of wave energy, so they reduce huge amounts of damage from things like hurricanes and other storms and flooding. And 1 billion people worldwide rely directly on our coral reefs as their main source of food and also for jobs. And then I wanted to show us some of our corals in our own backyard. So here in Florida, we call our shallow coral reef Florida's coral reef. And this doesn't include all of the corals in Florida, but this is the area that is most highly managed in our region. And Florida's coral reef extends 360 linear miles. So it goes almost down the entire coast of Florida. And it's the 3rd largest barrier reef in the world, behind the Great Barrier Reef and the Mesoamerican Reef. And then I popped up some pictures here of different corals we can see on our reefs here in Florida. And as we can see from these pictures, corals in Florida come in all shapes and sizes. And in total, we have 45 species of stony corals here in Florida. However, unfortunately, there are numerous stressors affecting our coral reefs. They include increasing temperature and ocean acidification from climate change, pollution, whether that be from plastics entering the environment or things like chemical runoff from fertilizers, coastal development, which we know is a huge issue here in Florida as we continue to develop on our coastlines. And lastly, disease, which was the main focus of my research here at Harbor Branch. And over time, these stressors are really taking a negative impact on our reefs globally. So here in Florida, specifically in the Florida Keys, we've actually lost 99% of our corals. Only 1% of them remain. And in other areas of the world, it isn't this bad. In the Pacific, there has been less loss of coral reefs, but globally, we have less than 50% of our reefs still left on Earth, which is so sad to hear. But how are we working to save corals? I want to go through a couple of the things that my lab is studying and how we're working to try and protect our coral reefs. These include restoration, population genetics, looking at mesophotic reefs, and looking at different stressors like hyposalinity, nutrients, and disease. So to save our coral reefs, we first need to know what is currently on our reefs. So we're able to do population genetics, and we can take different samples of corals and we do this by scuba diving, like in the pictures above. We're able to take these tissue samples from individual corals, preserve their tissue, and bring it back to our lab here at Harbor Branch. And then when we're at the lab, we're able to use a bunch of equipment here and extract DNA from the tissue. And this allows us to figure out what genetic variation we see out on our reefs, and also helps us to identify different species of corals and if any of them have potentially genes that help them survive better in the environment. We also use this on our mesophotic reefs. And mesophotic reefs, this means mid-light reefs. So they're not getting all of the light that our shallow reefs get, but they still have enough light to support coral life. And we have a really cool team of technical divers here at Harbor Branch. They went through a bunch of training to be able to dive to these deep depths. And we're looking at if we can take corals or some of their genetic variation from these deep reefs and apply it to our shallow reefs to help restore them. Since our shallow reefs, they're so close to land and close to human impacts. So we really want to preserve these shallow reefs that are being degraded over time by humans. We also look at things like disease. Here in Florida, we have stony coral tissue loss disease, which was first observed in 2014. And we still don't know what's causing this disease, but our lab has been researching ways to help prevent this disease from spreading. And one way to do this is using a medical paste. You can see that's that white Play-Doh looking material on the corals. And this paste has amoxicillin in it. And we've been looking at how effective this is on treating disease lesions on our corals. And giving the corals this medicine has been 95% effective. So this is a tool we're using to currently try and save our corals here in Florida. We also look a lot at restoration. So this was specifically my project that I did for my master's research. I looked at if corals could be outplanted on disease endemic reefs. And endemic just means that our reefs have had disease for over 9 months. And on these reefs, a lot of the susceptible corals, so corals that could have gotten the disease, they're already dead. So the disease is just present at this really low prevalence rate. And in the bottom right, you can see a picture of what those coral outplants looked like. We had 5 fragments of corals that we put on these cement bases, and we outplanted them all the way from Martin County, so almost up here near Harbor Branch, all the way down through the lower Keys. And 85% of our corals have survived, so this has been really promising for restoration on our reefs here in Florida. Some other stressors that we look at are hyposalinity stress. So we look at how freshwater releases from our inlets and canals impacts coral health. And we also look at things like nutrient stress. So how do excess nutrients like nitrogen and phosphorus, when they're released from things like fertilizer and agricultural practices, how do these releases of nutrients impact coral health and specifically coral disease? So we found that a lot of our human impacts, things we're releasing into the water, actually make coral diseases worse. So that's just a quick little overview about what we do here in the Coral Health and Ecology Lab at Harbor Branch. But I wanted to make sure I got to these slides that show you how you can get involved. So one way that you can get involved in helping to save our corals is advocating for them and speaking up for them. We have this new region, this new marine protected area that has been created on Florida's coral reef called the Kristen Jacobs Coral Reef Ecosystem Conservation Area. And they're currently taking public comment on this area to help determine how we should protect the corals in this marine protected area. So if you want to get involved, you can voice your opinion and give your public comment on that. But some other hands-on ways you can get involved is doing citizen science. So this involves restoration and outplanting, and also helping with cleanups like the one happening this weekend that we'll talk about later. But if you want to get involved in any of these, feel free to scan this QR code, and links will pop up that can direct you to more information. And here's one of those restoration groups. They involve citizen science in the Florida Keys through this program called iCare. And you can go down there for a day-long event, get training, get educated on corals and restoration, and go out with them on their boat and help them outplant corals in the Florida Keys. And some other daily things you can do to help our corals every day of your life is practice safe and responsible water activities. So whenever you're out swimming, snorkeling, diving, or just on the beach in general, make sure you're not taking marine life from their environment and you're not touching the reef, as this could damage corals. Also, take a reef-friendly approach to sun protection. So make sure you're using your reef-friendly sunscreen. And reef-friendly sunscreen doesn't have chemicals, so you can look for these ones up here, oxybenzone, and make sure those are not in your sunscreen that you're using. And then some quick other things you can do. You can minimize the use of fertilizers in your yard, recycle, and make sure you're disposing of trash properly. And then I also wanted to give a shout out to Harbor Branch. We have a lot of educational opportunities here on campus. We have a really cool Ocean Discovery Visitors Center with aquariums, with corals and fish. And this is a really cool experience where you can see the organisms we're working on and also get a tour of campus, go on a boat tour. And we also have a lot of virtual resources. So feel free to reach out to them at the links in the bottom. And we'd love to see you on campus for a tour. And with that, I will say thank you so much for joining me today and learning about corals. There's so much more about corals to learn. So if you have any more questions or want to learn more, feel free to reach out to me at my email and also check out our website. And yeah, thank you so much.